A woman sat on national television in April of 2026, looked straight into the camera, and told America that her husband was innocent of child abuse charges. Her voice stayed steady, her eyes never dropped. Lawyers had begged her for weeks to keep quiet, and she ignored every single one of them. That woman was Melissa Gilbert, the same girl who spent 9 seasons as America's favorite Prairie daughter, the child Michael Landon nicknamed Half Pint, the face of wholesome family television for an entire generation. And the story of how she ended up in that chair, defending a man indicted on 4 counts of criminal sexual contact with a minor, stretches all the way back to the very first day of her life. Because Melissa Gilbert's story has never really been about fame. It has been about one thing repeated over and over across 6 decades, and that thing is this: other people deciding who she was supposed to be while she fought to figure out the answer for herself. Someone else chose her family before she could open her eyes. Someone else turned her into a character before she finished growing up. Someone else decided what her face should look like, what size her body should be, and which version of the truth she was allowed to hear. And every time she finally broke free from one cage, another one was already waiting. What you are about to hear is not the polished Hollywood version of her life. This is the version underneath it. A life chosen for her. Melissa Gilbert entered the world on May 8, 1964, in Los Angeles, and before that first day ended, her entire identity had already been reassigned. Placed for adoption immediately after birth, she landed with a new family within 24 hours. Actor Paul Gilbert and actress Barbara Crane took her in, gave her a name, and folded her into a household deeply wired into the entertainment industry. That Hollywood connection ran even deeper through her mother's side of the family. Barbara's father was Harry Crane, the man who created the Honeymooners, which meant Melissa did not grow up near show business. She grew up completely inside it, surrounded by scripts and sets and the strange rhythm of a life built around cameras. And those cameras found her almost immediately. While most toddlers were still learning how to string words together, Melissa was already being placed in front of a lens. Commercials came first, including a well-known Alpo dog food spot alongside Lorne Greene, and that early start welded childhood and performance together before she understood the difference between the two. On the surface, all of this looked like good fortune, a loving family, a famous grandfather, early work that promised a bright future. What nobody outside the household knew was that the family carried a secret, and that secret would eventually crack open everything Melissa believed about her own history. The lie about her father. For years, the story inside the Gilbert household stayed simple and clean. Paul Gilbert, Melissa's adoptive father, had died of a stroke. That was the explanation she received, the one she carried through childhood and into her teenage years, the one she built her understanding of grief around. And then she discovered it was completely false. Paul Gilbert had not died of a stroke. His death came by suicide, and the people closest to Melissa had deliberately hidden that truth from her for years. They looked her in the eyes, told her a version of events they knew was incomplete, and let her mourn a death that happened in an entirely different way than she believed. The impact hit her like a wall. Melissa later described months where she could not eat normally, could not sleep through the night, and felt the grief return in a raw, brutal form that was worse than the original loss. Because this was not just about death anymore. This was about trust. The very people assigned to protect her had decided she could not handle reality, and they chose the story for her without asking. That betrayal landed on top of an already fractured childhood. Her parents had divorced when she was 6, and the family reshaped itself again when her mother remarried, bringing new relatives, new rules, and a blended household that appeared stable from the outside but felt complicated underneath. A girl dealing with adoption, divorce, and a hidden death learned something dangerous during those years. She learned that smiling through pain was a survival skill, and that the version of yourself the world sees does not have to match the version living inside you. That lesson was about to become her entire career, becoming Laura Ingalls. Late in 1973, Melissa walked into an audition for a new television series called Little House on the Prairie. Roughly 500 girls competed for the role of Laura Ingalls, and she beat every one of them. 9 years old at the time, she filmed the pilot, which aired as a television movie on March 30, 1974, and the full series launched that September. Michael Landon, already a household name from his years on Bonanza, personally approved her casting. At 37, he stepped into a role that went far beyond co-star. On set, Landon became Melissa's mentor, her guide, and the closest thing she had to a father figure after losing Paul Gilbert. The nickname he gave her, Half Pint, stuck both on screen and off, and it became so embedded in the public imagination that people used it as though it were her actual name. From 1974 to 1983, Melissa appeared in nearly every episode of the show, growing up on camera between the ages of 9 and 18. Shooting ran 5 days a week in Simi Valley and on studio stages, with schooling squeezed into the legally required 3 hours per day for child performers in California. While other kids her age worried about homework and friendships, Melissa carried scenes in one of NBC's biggest family dramas, and the weight of that responsibility shaped her in ways nobody predicted. Because Laura Ingalls was not just a character Melissa played, Laura became a second identity that millions of viewers projected onto a real child. Audiences refused to separate the actress from the role. They saw Laura and assumed they were seeing Melissa, and they expected her to be kind, grateful, wholesome, and perfectly behaved at all times. Fans and people on set treated her as if Laura Ingalls was not a performance, but her true personality. Melissa leaned into it because she had already learned that performing equals love, and that's where the deepest damage took root. She later admitted that playing Laura felt like an escape from her real life, since the Prairie was simpler and the script always told her what to do. But the longer she lived inside that character, the harder it became to locate the actual girl underneath. The gap between the child audiences adored and the girl carrying private confusion widened every single year. When the show wrapped in 1983, with follow-up television movies stretching into 1984, Melissa had collected a Golden Globe nomination from 1981 and several Young Artist Awards. She was a teenage icon, recognized everywhere she went, and she had no idea who she actually was without Laura Ingalls telling her. Searching for Melissa. The 1980s became a frantic search for identity. With the show behind her, Melissa moved through a world that looked nothing like Walnut Grove. She dated Rob Lowe, circled the Brat Pack crowd, showed up at Hollywood parties alongside rock stars like Billy Idol, and chased a version of freedom that felt exciting on the surface. Underneath, none of it was free. She later wrote that the whole period was really about proving, to the industry and to herself, that she existed beyond the girl in braids and a bonnet. Darker roles became the weapon she used to fight that image. And to her credit, some of those swings connected. Back in 1979, while still on Little House, 15-year-old Melissa stepped onto a New York stage to play Helen Keller in The Miracle Worker, a role demanding physical struggle and emotional range that family television never asked of her. That performance proved she could survive difficult material and step outside the safe world of the Prairie. She kept pushing in that direction throughout the mid-1980s. Choices of the Heart came in 1983, casting her as Jean Donovan, one of 4 American churchwomen murdered in El Salvador in 1980. Blood Vows followed in 1987, placing her inside a story of a mafia wife surrounded by crime, fear, and betrayal. None of these were gentle projects chosen by accident. Each one represented a deliberate attempt to force the industry to see an actress with depth instead of a child star repeating the same safe image. The cruel truth about being a former child star caught up with her anyway. Audiences remembered what they wanted to remember, and what America wanted to remember was Half Pint. 2 attempts at leading adult television series made that painfully clear. Stand By Your Man, a Fox sitcom running from 1992 to 1993, lasted 19 episodes before cancellation. Sweet Justice on NBC followed from 1994 to 1995, casting her as attorney Kate Delroy, and that also ended after a single season. Both represented real opportunities on paper, but neither could overcome the gravitational pull of Laura Ingalls. Critics compared her, audiences compared her. No matter how far she stretched, the elastic snapped back to the Prairie every time. That inability to be recognized as anyone beyond Laura corroded something inside her over the years. This was not just a career frustration. It was an identity crisis that reached all the way down, and in the absence of a clear answer about who she really was, Melissa found other ways to fill the silence. The fall. Substance problems did not begin on the Little House set. They arrived later, during her late 30s, after her grandfather died, and grief tangled together with family stress and years of unresolved emotional pain. Drinking started as a way to fall asleep at night, and it escalated quietly. One glass became two, two became a bottle, and eventually Melissa was consuming up to 2 bottles of wine every single night. Prescription medication abuse joined the pattern during the same period. One moment captured where all of this led. She was at home entertaining a friend and drank so heavily that she passed out in her dog's bed. Not on the couch, not in a chair, but on the floor in the dog's bed. Sometimes rock bottom arrives with drama, and sometimes it arrives with embarrassment so sharp it cuts through everything else. That humiliation cracked something open. Therapy came next, followed by Alcoholics Anonymous, and around 2004, Melissa finally reached sobriety. Getting sober did not mean getting free, because another cage had been building around her for years, and this one was physically attached to her body. The face in the mirror. Shortly after turning 18, Melissa got her first rhinoplasty, hoping for a nose that looked better on camera after years of growing up in front of an audience. The tip healed in a way she disliked, which sent her back for a second procedure, and that is exactly how these things begin. One fix leads to another fix, which opens the door to adjustments that never quite feel finished. Breast implants came next, then fillers, then Botox, then a rotation of cosmetic treatments designed to maintain what casting directors and agents kept describing as a fresh look. She has admitted that the more she tried to improve her face, the less familiar it started to feel, and that pressure only deepened as she moved through her 40s. Hollywood's expectations were blunt. Stay around a size 2 or 4 to remain competitive. Keep the skin smooth, keep the lines invisible. None of that changed regardless of how long she had been in the business, and she had been acting since the age of 9. After her 2011 divorce from Bruce Boxleitner, the cosmetic upkeep intensified into something closer to routine maintenance. Botox, fillers, laser treatments, and hair dye all became part of a cycle she could not step out of. And then one day, Melissa looked in the mirror and realized the woman staring back was a stranger. That face was not hers. It was a construction assembled from fear of aging, fear of irrelevance, and fear of being seen as she actually was. And that is the moment connecting everything in her story. From adoption to Laura Ingalls to cosmetic surgery, the pattern never changed. Someone else was always deciding what Melissa Gilbert's face should look like. Someone else was always choosing which version of her the world got to see. Once she understood that pattern, she began tearing it apart. Leaving Los Angeles. The real break started around 2013, when Melissa left Los Angeles, and she later explained the reason in terms that left no room for misunderstanding. She had to get out because the city itself made aging feel dangerous. Every billboard, every casting call, every dinner party reinforced the message that growing older was a personal failure, and she could not fight that message while standing in the middle of it. Visible changes followed quickly. She cut her hair, Botox stopped, fillers stopped. Then in 2015, she announced publicly that she was having her breast implants removed because they were causing health concerns and no longer fit the life she wanted. During the years she spent living in rural Michigan, many of the cosmetic extras simply fell away because the old pressure was no longer confronting her every day. That distance changed more than her appearance. It rewired how she lived. By the time she reached her late 50s and early 60s, Melissa was speaking about aging with a confidence that felt entirely different from anything she had expressed before. In interviews around 2024 and 2025, she went after the language itself, calling anti-aging one of her least favorite phrases because, in her own words, anti-aging means dead. That framing exposed the whole problem, she argued, turning a normal human process into something women were expected to fight with needles, chemicals, and shame. When May of 2024 arrived and she turned 60, Melissa called it the most incredible year and declared that she had earned every line, every scar, and every opinion that came with it. That was not a statement about vanity, it was a claim of ownership. For the first time in 60 years, the face the world was seeing belonged to the woman who chose it. Loss, and starting over. Understanding what happened with Timothy Busfield requires understanding the wreckage that came before him, because Melissa Gilbert's love life follows the same pattern as everything else in her story. Someone else choosing, someone else deciding. And Melissa trying to locate herself inside relationships built on everything except solid ground. Her first marriage arrived on February 22, 1988, when she was 23 years old, just 7 weeks after ending a highly publicized engagement to Rob Lowe. That timeline alone reveals she was running from something rather than running toward something. On May 1, 1989, their son Dakota Paul Brinkman was born. While Melissa was drinking heavily and struggling with emotional instability, she later connected to untreated alcoholism. The marriage to actor Bo Brinkman collapsed into infidelity, substance abuse, and violent arguments before the divorce finalized in 1994. Looking back on those years, Melissa has never dressed them up. She calls them chaotic and deeply self-destructive. Her second marriage started with a different kind of hope. On January 1, 1995, she married actor Bruce Boxleitner, and later that year, on October 6th, they welcomed a son named Michael Garrett Boxleitner. The name carried enormous emotional weight because Michael came from Michael Landon, the only father figure who had never let her down. Melissa wanted this marriage to be the safe place she had been searching for her entire life. It was not. She later admitted spending 16 years chasing emotional security inside that relationship, drinking to manage loneliness, and waiting for Bruce to rescue her from pain she needed to rescue herself from. They separated quietly in 2010 and finalized the divorce in 2011. And then something shifted. In 2012, Melissa walked into a bar in Los Angeles at 47 years old. Timothy Busfield, 55, was sitting at the counter eating pizza. Both carried children from earlier marriages. Both carried decades of private damage behind familiar television faces. Neither one performed when they started talking. No games, no urgency, no masks, just two people who had lived through enough to recognize what steadiness felt like. Busfield proposed by December of 2012, and on April 24, 2013, they married in a small private ceremony at San Isidro Ranch in Santa Barbara. Melissa wore a red dress instead of white, a choice that matched the moment perfectly because this was never a story about innocence. This was about experience, survival, and one more chance to build something real. After the wedding, they moved away from Los Angeles and constructed a life that felt intentionally smaller and calmer. Michigan came first, then a restored 14-acre former hunter cabin in the Catskills region of upstate New York. She let her hair go naturally gray, stopped coloring it entirely, and started spending her days gardening, cooking, and living in a way that had nothing to do with camera angles or public approval. For people who had watched Melissa survive decades of chaos, the image of her life with Busfield felt like the ending she deserved. It looked like proof that peace was possible even after repeated devastation. And then January of 2026 arrived, and that proof shattered. The arrest. Timothy Busfield was arrested in New Mexico after two 11-year-old twin boys from the set of The Cleaning Lady, a Fox crime drama, accused him of sexual abuse. Weeks later, a Bernalillo County grand jury in Albuquerque handed down an indictment. 4 counts of criminal sexual contact with a minor against 68-year-old Busfield, tied to work he had done on the show between November of 2022 and spring of 2024. Prosecutors alleged that he inappropriately touched one twin over the child's clothing when the boy was 7 and again at 8, while the boy's 11-year-old twin also reported abuse. The arrest warrant, issued on January 9, 2026, also referenced an earlier allegation involving a 16-year-old girl during an audition at Sacramento Street Theater, a company Busfield had co-founded. He pleaded not guilty and recorded a video calling the accusations lies, even as authorities described what they called a pattern of misconduct spanning years and more than one project. For Melissa, this was not just a legal crisis, it was the pattern of her entire life repeating at its cruelest volume. The man she had finally trusted to see her real self was now at the center of allegations so disturbing they threatened to rewrite everything. When Melissa finally spoke publicly on Good Morning America in early April of 2026, roughly 2 months after the indictment, she left no room for ambiguity about where she stood. Looking directly into the camera, she called Busfield the last person in the world who would hurt a child, and added that she trusted him with her children's lives. Lawyers had advised her for weeks to stay silent, and she chose that moment to reject their counsel entirely. She described January 13, 2026, the day of his arrest, as the moment everything changed. Finances collapsed, friendships vanished. Projects under their shared modern Prairie brand fell apart because potential partners no longer wanted their names attached to Busfield. Sitting beside her husband during the interview, Melissa said their life as they knew it was done and spoke openly about grieving a future they believed they were building together. And then she said something that stopped people cold. She stated plainly that even if Timothy were exonerated, he would always be that guy. The accusation had attached itself to his name permanently, and no verdict would ever fully remove it. The public response split immediately. Some viewers saw a loyal wife standing beside her husband with absolute conviction. Others saw a woman who had spent decades inside denial now doing it again at far higher stakes. What made the moment so uncomfortable was that both readings were entirely possible, and Melissa appeared to understand that. She acknowledged the cost, she admitted the damage could not be undone. She stood there anyway. Busfield was released on his own recognizance after approximately a week in jail, with around 70 support letters filed on his behalf. A jury trial was tentatively scheduled for May of 2027. Describing the months after the arrest, Melissa used a phrase heavy enough to carry the weight of her entire life. She called it a permanent storm, and for a woman who had already survived adoption secrets, a father's hidden suicide, identity erasure, addiction, 2 divorces, and financial ruin, that phrase was not an exaggeration. It was an acknowledgement that some storms never pass. They simply become the weather you live inside. A body at war. Physical pain had been running alongside the emotional battles for years. Around 2010, a serious back injury set off more than a decade of chronic suffering, compounding damage from a broken back she sustained in 2001, and a spinal fusion that followed. In March of 2012, at 47, Melissa joined season 14 of Dancing with the Stars, paired with Maxim Chmerkovskiy and performing live each week before an ABC audience of roughly 18 million viewers. On April 9th of that year, during a Paso Doble routine set to a Kiss medley, she fell and struck her head. She finished the entire routine before being quietly taken from the studio by ambulance. Doctors diagnosed a concussion and whiplash, layering fresh trauma onto neck damage that had been accumulating for years. Even after missing the live results show, she returned to compete again and ultimately finished 5th. By 2019, constant nerve pain was spreading from her neck into both arms, accompanied by numbness and headaches that disrupted her sleep and made simple movement difficult. November of 2020 brought major surgery at age 56, where doctors removed old hardware and repaired deteriorating discs in her neck, aiming to halt progressive nerve damage. 3 weeks after the operation, she updated fans that she felt really good, one of the few pieces of straightforwardly positive news in a story that rarely offered them. Everyday life delivered its own scares. In June of 2023, at her Catskills cabin, Melissa noticed what looked like an ordinary insect bite on her left arm. Within 24 hours, the area had swollen dramatically and developed red streaks, classic signs of a spreading infection. By the time she reached the emergency room, a fever had set in. Doctors diagnosed cellulitis with an abscess forming beneath the skin, marked the infection spread with pen, started intravenous antibiotics, and warned her that without treatment it could have entered her bloodstream within days. The condition without a name. And then there was something she had carried her entire life without knowing what it was. In 2024, at 60 years old, Melissa received a diagnosis that reframed decades of silent suffering, misophonia, a neurological condition that triggers extreme distress in response to specific sounds, finally gave a name to reactions she had experienced since childhood. She remembered sitting in classroom scenes on the Little House set during the mid-1970s while other kids chewed gum or tapped their fingernails against desks. Her entire body would flood with panic. Her face would flush red. She would fight the urge to scream or run from the room. For decades, she believed those reactions meant she was mean, that she was unstable, that something was fundamentally broken inside her personality. Discovering it had a clinical name in 2024 changed the way she understood herself. The path to help started in 2023 when she reached out to Duke University's Center for Misophonia and Emotion Regulation with a simple message asking for help. Dr. Zach Rosenthal, the center's director, told her treatment existed and that she was not alone. 16 weeks of intensive cognitive behavioral therapy followed, teaching her to recognize early physical warning signs, like her feet clenching, before full panic seized her body. By 2024, she was speaking publicly about misophonia and partnering with Duke and media outlets to push for awareness and research funding. Another hidden truth spoken out loud after years of silence. Another part of herself she had been taught to be ashamed of, finally claimed and owned. Rebuilding in plain sight. Writing became one of the first tools Melissa used to dismantle the old image. When her memoir Prairie Tale arrived in June of 2009, she was 45 and ready to tear apart the polished picture fans had carried of her for decades. The book did not read like a celebrity memoir designed to make her look sympathetic. It read like a confession designed to make her feel real. Addiction, plastic surgery she regretted, failed relationships, and a deep sense of insecurity around what she called Hollywood's beautiful people. All of it went onto the page without a filter. 2 more books followed in 2014, each reflecting a different side of the same woman. Daisy and Josephine was a children's story about a shy girl and her dog, and beneath its gentle surface echoed the loneliness that had shaped parts of Melissa's own childhood. My Prairie cookbook blended more than 80 recipes with behind-the-scenes memories and over 75 scrapbook photos from the Little House years. Warmth and nostalgia filled the pages, but they also revealed something quieter. After years inside Hollywood's machinery, she still longed for home, for simplicity, for the messy, imperfect closeness that real families share. Leadership became another form of reinvention. In November of 2001, Melissa won the presidency of the Screen Actors Guild after a hard-fought election against Valerie Harper. Re-elected in 2003, she served until 2005, navigating union politics during a period still raw from a 6-month strike in 2000 and ongoing disputes over non-union work and overseas production. The role demanded toughness, directness, and the ability to handle conflict under genuine pressure. It was not a performance, it was real authority applied to real problems with real consequences, and she managed it as one of the few former child stars to ever hold that kind of institutional power. Modern Prairie and a New Purpose. In 2022, more than 45 years after her Little House debut in 1974, Melissa launched Modern Prairie, a lifestyle brand and online community built specifically for women over 50. That audience was the entire point. She was no longer trying to remain appealing to a youth-obsessed industry. She was speaking directly to women who had lived enough life to understand exactly what she meant. She appeared on camera wearing little makeup or none at all. She talked openly about menopause, hot flashes, sagging skin, and body changes that most public figures treated as topics to avoid. She connected the brand to her own daily routines, drawing from gardening, simple cooking, and the reality of living in a small cabin she and Busfield had spent years restoring. Even acting choices reflected this philosophy. She did not stop performing after leaving Los Angeles, but she stopped trying to squeeze herself into younger versions of who she used to be. In the off-Broadway play Still, which opened in New York on February 6th during the mid-2020s, she played a woman in her mid-60s confronting a romance from 30 years earlier. Performing opposite Mark Moses, she used the role to explore something deeply personal, including the long emotional trail of marriages, divorces, and reinventions that defined her own life. She later said that choosing age-appropriate roles felt more radical in modern entertainment than pretending to be 40. In December of 2025, Melissa partnered with the Pancreatic Cancer Action Network to honor Michael Landon, who died of pancreatic cancer at 54 in 1991. 34 years after his death, the man who nicknamed her Half Pint and stood in for the father she lost still held a place in her life she actively chose to honor. And in her early 60s, she shared another milestone by revealing she was cancer-free at 62, pairing that relief with advocacy rather than simply celebrating herself. The thread that connects everything. Every chapter of Melissa Gilbert's life circles back to the same collision, the version of her that other people created and the woman who actually existed underneath it. She was given a family before she could open her eyes. She was told a false story about how her father died. A television character swallowed her identity for nearly a decade. An industry demanded she reshape her own face to stay relevant. 2 marriages were built on someone else's idea of what safety looked like, and the 3rd marriage, the one that finally felt real, now carries a weight that neither innocence nor guilt can fully resolve. Every single time, the truth turned out to be different from the story, and every single time, Melissa had to survive the distance between the two. What makes her story more than just a catalog of pain is that she kept choosing honesty, even when honesty cost her. Not always immediately, not always gracefully, but eventually, she always chose it. She published a memoir that ripped apart 3 decades of public image. She removed the implants. She let the gray hair grow. She named the addiction. She named the misophonia. She stood on national television during the worst chapter of her life and said exactly what she believed, knowing full well that half the country would hate her for it. Today she lives in a restored cabin on 14 acres in the Catskills with hair she no longer dyes, a face she no longer injects, and a life that looks nothing like the one Hollywood built for her. She gardens, she cooks, she shows up on camera exactly as she is. She has said that her wrinkles and sunlines hold the story of everything she has lived through, from child stardom to tabloid scrutiny to divorce to an industry that spent decades telling women their faces were problems to be solved. And she is right, those lines hold all of it. But they also hold something no photograph from 1976 could have captured. They hold the slow, painful, decades-long process of a woman learning to stop performing for a world that was never going to love the real her as much as it loved the character. After 62 years of being told who to be, Melissa Gilbert decided to be herself, whoever that turned out to be. However messy, however imperfect, however far from the prairie that road carried her. Because that is what Half Pint was always searching for. Not fame, not approval, not the perfect nose or the perfect marriage or the perfect image, just the right to be a whole person. And after everything, she is still fighting for it,